Okay, great. I think we can get started with introductions. Welcome to stream 2, and the theme for today is going to be about the gendered impact of COVID-19 on the economy and the South African context, but also the continental context and global context. I'll be introducing our speakers. Dr. Smriti Rao, do you have a question? Oh, sorry, I saw that your hand was up.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah. I'll just be introducing our speakers, and you'll see that with the speakers we have today, all of their research focus has been around gender and COVID-19 and economics, which is amazing for the discipline of feminist economics. They will be speaking in the order that I've introduced them in. First, we have Professor Akosua Keseboa Darkwah, who's a professor and the head of the School of Sociology at the University of Ghana, and her research at the moment is focused on the impact of COVID-19 on various stakeholders in the Ghanaian food system. So that's quite interesting. And followed by her, we're going to have Odile Mackett from the University of the Witwatersrand School of Governance, where she is a lecturer and also completing her PhD. And her research focus is about the International Labour Organization's very traditional definition of work and how that definition of work is going to impact gender equality in the labor market. So very interesting research, and generally her research is about labor market access and the impact of that on inequality and poverty. Thirdly, we're going to have Dr. Smriti Rao, who's a professor of economics and global studies at Assumption University in Massachusetts, and she's affiliated with the Women's Research Study Center in Brandeis University. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And her, she said that I should describe her research interests as Marxist, or rather feminist economic studies. So I think that's very interesting, and I'm excited to hear about that. And lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Deborah Shepard from South Africa's Stellenbosch University, and her research interests are also around the impact of COVID-19 and the very gendered impact of COVID-19 on the economy. And I found this quite interesting. She's doing the research with the Socioeconomic Policy Group at Stellenbosch University, but previously she's published with the UCLA School of Law's Williams Institute, and her research focus was on the impact of LGBTQI discrimination on the economy. So having done the introductions, I think we can start with our first speaker. Dr. Darkwah, would you like to speak?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my ongoing research and hope that we have a good discussion about what this means for gender and social reproduction. Just a little bit of background for those who don't know Ghana. So it's a population of 30 million, and our food system is fairly informal, so small scale workers, both male and female. Half of our food is grown by women, and much of our trade is done by women. Our poverty levels, we've got a quarter of the population living under poverty. In 2015, there was a banking crisis. So those who'd saved monies in microfinance institutions found their monies disappearing. The state does provide some support for social reproduction. So we have financial support to help with buying the basics, and there's a national health insurance scheme and so on and so forth. But that's our condition before COVID hits. When COVID hits, we get a 3-week lockdown in March. And then after that, we have an easing of the different kinds of measures that we had. Studies show that the major impact was economic. So 85% of the population have lost income as a result of COVID. Now, measures. Schools were closed for 10 months from March till January this year. And so parents had to figure out what to do with their children, even as they went to work. In the markets, there were rules now about who could come into work. So market women had to rotate who was going to go into work at any point in time. And then we had to obey social distancing and all of that. In terms of mitigation, there was a subsidy on water So you didn't pay for water for 9 months. And then there was business support for businesses, but I'll skip that. And I just want to highlight some of the impacts from ground up, right? And just looking at one dimension of what reproducing the next generation of workers, reproducing labor on a daily basis is. So just in terms of food, what we eat has changed in terms of the number of times we eat and the quantity of food we cook. With schools closed, I'm compelled to feed my children twice a day to minimize consumption expenditure. And the amount is decreased as well. We are cooking 3 cups of rice in the past. We were cooking 3 cups in the past. Now we have reduced it to 2 cups. Then a second person selling onions. We rationed the food because business was affected. And my wife had to put a stop to her business. We didn't go a day without eating, but instead of 3 times, we made it 2 times. Now, the state attempted to help with social reproduction issues. And one of the big ones that we talked about a lot was what it did in terms of loans, in terms of water and electricity provision. But I just want to point out how our basic infrastructure is not as developed as it should be. And therefore, the state's efforts at helping in this didn't go as well as it could have. So with particular reference to water, very few Ghanaians actually have pipe-borne water that comes out of the taps in your home. So while the government was well-intentioned and provided free water, you could only really get that if you had pipe-borne water out of your homes. Otherwise, people get water through tanks. So tanks bring the water, and the tankers were not going to do that for free. So you find that on the ground, people were talking about the fact that they didn't have free water. Now, given that COVID requires the use of water for washing hands, keeping things clean, even without all the other things about needing water to clean and to cook and so on, you can see that the state was well-intentioned, but people were really not benefiting from that. And water fetching is a female activity. So given the COVID and the increased need for hygiene at home, women and girls were having to find water at the same rates as before because they couldn't benefit from the free water. Remember that we talked about how monies had been declined. So you had less income, more need for water. And even though the government was seeking to make it easy on you, that wasn't quite what was happening on the ground. So how then did women and men make it happen? Now, social reproduction is not just the responsibility of women, but around the world, it's heavily feminized. And you found that in the Ghanaian context as well, that when you were speaking to men and women, they were pointing out that the business of keeping us together, even during the COVID, was really left to women to figure out. So here's a good quote about how they managed to eat 3 meals a day in this particular case. And he points out, my wife understands and didn't complain about the reduction in the housekeeping money. So daily food intake didn't change, which means the husband was giving the wife the same amount of money. Food prices had gone up, but somehow she managed to ensure that they ate the 3 meals a day. That's because she found the money for it based on her own income. Or if you were speaking to the woman, as we found with others, they were decreasing what they would eat so that the children, especially in a household, will get the meals that they should get. I just want to do another bit of discussion around childcare so you get a sense of how that shifted as well. So here's a woman who sells cassava. Her toddler could no longer go to school. Schools were closed for 10 months. She had to go into work. So she would take the kid to the neighbor. When she would come home, though, she would discover that there was a problem. The kids are fought, the baby is hurt. Another woman, just to give you a taste of yet another one, talked about how she was torn between selling at the market and leaving to cater for the children at home. Sometimes she would make them come to the market with her, put them to work, and then they would go home. The kids were aged between 4 and 15. But when they went home, they were basically left to their own devices. They found new ways of playing outside on the streets. And then there's just one example of contestation at home about what to do in terms of childcare and whose responsibility is it going to be. So my son would have been in school, but he's still sitting at home, always disturbing his mother. Sometimes she asks me to take him to the shop, but I don't have time to be taking care of him. He does note, though, that his mom is a seamstress, and when the baby is around her at work, his presence makes it difficult for her to sew more dresses to serve her customers. But basically, his take was he can't have the baby at work with him. He doesn't have the time to be taking care of him, as he puts it. So the responsibility of taking care of the child is left to his mother to figure out. In this particular case, the mother is not a worker in the food system, so we didn't interview the mother. But in the other cases where we're interviewing mothers who were also food system actors, you found that they had a choice. Either they took their children with them to work, and in a space like the market, we were then exposing the children to the potential of getting COVID themselves, or we left them to their own devices because they can't do both, and they need support to make it happen. And that support isn't one that we consider fully in the ways in which the capitalist system operates. So even though when you think about Ghana, you don't think of Ghana as having a fully corporatized food system. The logic in a fully corporatized food system operates in this informal food system as well, as state and the market doesn't consider what it takes at household level to ensure that people's lives are able to go on day in, day out, so that they can show up at work the next day and give up their best in the world of work. And really, when there's a crunch, as happened with COVID, then what that means is that women have to work magic. Women have to be the ones scraping and scrimping and figuring out how they are going to not just survive themselves, but also ensure that their families survive and can move on day in, day out to give up their best in the larger society in which we live. And I think that the Ghanaian case presents a very good example and evidence for the discussion and the arguments made by Marxist feminist economists that something has to shift. COVID has provided us a perfect opportunity to step back and say, we cannot continue in the ways in which we've continued in the past. We have to do things differently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for that compelling presentation. I think next we can proceed with Odile Mackett. Would you start your presentation?
Perfect, thanks. I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to be speaking. But thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'll try and not speak for too long. I really want to talk about time today, which is something that's of interest to me, TIME, time. And COVID-19 has reminded us of how valuable our time is. We were and still are in a race against time. First it was for the vaccine, then it was, to beat the next wave, and all in an effort to increase the amount of time we get to spend on Earth and to ensure the survival, our survival as individuals and the human race. But I really enjoy studying time because it's one of the most equally spread resources we have, and yet we don't often recognize it as a resource. No one can give us more and no one can take away time from us. This is the case regardless of how much money you have. But of course, not everyone has the same degree of autonomy when deciding how they want to spend their time. During the pandemic, the various lockdowns, the households became the locus for everything and every activity that we engaged in as people. We worked there, we relaxed there, we spent time there with our families, and this was really the case for happy homes anyway. In other homes, the unemployed took refuge as they had to stop their job searches and other survivalist activities. Women were the subjects of domestic violence, while other workers didn't have the privilege of staying home. They had to risk being exposed to the virus to earn their wages, such as service and healthcare workers. The pandemic also showed us how much work was to be done in the household. This was exacerbated by the closure of schools and restaurants and other establishments which we've now become accustomed to outsourcing our housework to. And because women are responsible for the bulk of this household, they also carried the bulk of this increased burden. We know from statistics collected during the pandemic and papers written by researchers and academics, including our esteemed panelist, Dr. Debra, that women were more likely to lose their jobs. They were less likely to get back into the labor force once lockdown restrictions were eased, and remained primarily responsible for childcare and related housework. This was specifically the case in South Africa, but there's evidence which suggests that what happened in South Africa was not isolated. Something that's been coming on a long time before the pandemic is the decent work agenda. The International Labour Organization's agenda aims at leveling the playing field between business, workers, and government. An author has stated that that decent work involves a change in how we understand the normative basis for regulating work, a movement away from unequal bargaining power and subordination to a more contested and contextualized understanding of the values that work regulation ought to achieve. In addition to this, gender equality in the labor market is listed as a cross-cutting goal of the agenda. In other words, gender equality should be at the heart of everything that the agenda promotes. And the agenda has nudged many countries in the right direction in terms of promoting labor rights for the most marginalized workers, but it's really only useful for people who are actually employed. This presents a problem in societies where the bulk of the working population is unemployed. In the South African context, this privileged group represents less than 40% of the labor force. And here I say they are privileged for being counted amongst the employed, but for many, this is the only privilege that their work presents, because being employed presents little comfort in the face of the suffering many endure working for poverty wages, working long hours, and doing dangerous jobs. When considering discouraged work seekers and those who do not form part of the labor force for whatever reason, this proportion becomes even smaller. So what the agenda has failed to do at a practical level is recognize the unpaid labor which takes place in our households and our communities, the institutions which form the foundation of well-functioning societies. By invisibilizing the household, the ILO has perpetuated the long-standing tradition in economics of prioritizing outcomes for the productive sphere of the economy, the domain where we value selfishness, competitiveness, profits, and the apparent rationality of individuals. And in trying to level the playing field between business, workers, and government, they have actually further emboldened and increased the bargaining power of business or the market. When considering the large cohort of unemployed individuals, as well as the lack of inclusion of unpaid reproductive labor, one really has to ask, what use is such a narrowly defined agenda to a country like South Africa and many other developing countries which face similar challenges? When we think about this from a time perspective, we really will never achieve gender equality in the labor market or broader society, as long as these are the underlying values that we promote. And of course, these values are necessary for the stability and sustainability of capitalist economies. In this sense, women are invaluable to the continued functioning of the capitalist system. Their labor as paid and unpaid laborers is highly necessary and very valuable. But as we all know, markets are unable to accurately allocate value. It's hard to argue from this perspective that the capitalist system is one which promotes justice and equality. And I want to read a quote here, which I absolutely love, from the Routledge Handbook of Feminist Economics, which was published this year. And I don't want to mention the authors' names because they have characters which I've never seen in my life, and I don't want to mispronounce their names. But it's on page 277 of the book. It says that time is acknowledged as the universal input for doing anything, and hence the ultimate currency for equality and justice. I get goosebumps when I read that quote. We can think about the time it takes for someone to access services which allow them to exercise their basic human rights. In South Africa, we could take healthcare, for instance. It's difficult to fathom how someone who needs to take off an entire day to go to a clinic and seek treatment could ever secure a decent job. People who rely on poorly delivered public services or are victims of the non-delivery of public services cannot invest in the skills needed to eventually secure decent jobs in a capitalist economy because they don't have time. Sure, we can talk about the odd security guard who used his spare time to study a LLB through UNISA and today he's a lawyer, but just like female CEOs, those are outliers. public policies are not designed with outliers in mind. They are designed to service the majority or those who make up the norm. Where government does not deliver services to people, people have to pay with their time. Whether it be standing in a clinic or hospital queue, waiting for a grant to be paid, having to fetch water because there's no tap in the house, or having to make fire because there's no electricity, all these things take time. I just want to add here that there is a certain South African bank, which I will not name, which offers people very low fees. But let me tell you, I have never walked past that bank and not seen people waiting in a line to be served. They even have chairs outside their branches because that's how long people have to wait. In addition to the lines at their branches, you need to see the lines people have to wait in to draw money from their ATMs, of which there are often only a few in a particular location. Now I ask myself, is it right to entice people with lower fees, but make them pay with their time? Are you really pro-poor, or can you really say that you are empowering the previously unbanked? Delivering your services in a way that does not cut corners needs to be part of the empowerment package. That means, as a bank, taking a small cut in your profits to expand the capacity of your branches, because stealing people's time is another form of exploitation. But this bank is just a side note. When services are not delivered by the government or by businesses or markets, households have to deliver them, because who else is going to do it? Often, I repeat, it is the women in the household who have to give their time to deliver these services. But how long can we really endure these injustices and inequalities, which not only women, but other groupings in our societies experience? There are many angles from which we can look at this picture, many things which rob people of their time. You cannot say that you promote gender equality and not recognize women's unpaid work. This is true whether we are talking about the gender wage gap or gender equality more broadly. I think this has become pretty obvious in recent months. In the same way, you cannot fail to deliver quality services and say that you care about the poor. You cannot engage in corrupt activities and claim to care about the well-being of Black people. Corruption and a lack of service delivery, these things are inherently anti-poor and anti-feminist, and they cause suffering. The problem with the suffering, though, as if there's a type of suffering that is not problematic, is that it's private and it's secluded. It's in the household. Again, these are the households on which we build our communities and our societies. When we relegate the suffering to the household, we really can't be shocked when we see adults looting shops and children following their lead to steal a pair of decent shoes or a loaf of bread. From a decent work perspective, can we really continue along the way we are currently going? Because this means that women as a group will never really have decent work. Even if women in well-paid jobs are able to outsource their care responsibilities to someone else, the someone else who takes over from them will likely also be a woman too, and will probably suffer from decent work deficits if she is paid, or her labor will simply be invisible and undefined according to decent work measurements. The structural inequalities will persist. So this presents a cycle of exploitation and injustice and gives credence to writers who have defined the decent work agenda as something which promotes an enhanced version of the present, rather than something which presents a fundamentally different world. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, a fundamentally different world is what we need to start imagining right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Odile. I just want to sort of like highlight how similar the presentation you've made based on the South African context is to what the previous speaker said about what's been happening in Ghana. I think a lot of the research is really reinforcing one another. So could we please have our next speaker, Dr. Smriti? Are you ready to present?
Yes, I don't have a PowerPoint, and I want to thank you for inviting me to participate. And I've really enjoyed the previous comments by my very distinguished panelists, and I think what I'm going to say is also going to tie very much into what they have already said. And I just want to preface this by saying, I work in the United States, but my research is primarily on India. And so I'm going to caveat my comments by saying they're very much influenced by the Indian context. But again, I think there are probably a lot of resonances with what might be occurring in Africa. And that would be very interesting to discuss in the discussion session. So I'm sort of generally, and I think my panelists are too, based on their comments, part of what has been a resurgence of Marxist feminism in the last decade or more, maybe decade and a half, that really deeply engages with this concept of social reproduction. And perhaps not coincidentally, this resurgence has coincided with a renewed sort of set of crises confronting capitalism as a system. Specifically, of course, the 2009 crises. And now we can think about COVID perhaps as this the first of many future crises that may be linked to climate change and the ecological degradations of our Capitalocene era. So what I want to comment on today is perhaps is sort of how does engaging with the Marxist feminist concept of social reproduction shape our thinking about capitalist crises, including this one. And if we think about one of the, the key sort of contributions of Marxist feminist work, both in the 60s and 70s, and then again revived in the last decade and a half, is of course that it adds the production and maintenance of life itself, and thus of labor power, to Marx's original formulation of the term social reproduction. And without getting into too many details, broadly, what this literature does is it explicitly invokes the capitalist configuration within which what otherwise might be called care activities are organized, right? So it makes that link between care activities and the larger capitalist system within which they're embedded. And therefore, at the core of this kind of feminism is the conviction that we cannot understand production without reproduction, and vice versa, that gender relations co-constituted by class, race, caste, age, space shape both the spheres of production and reproduction, right? So you don't only study gender in the sphere of reproduction, you also study it in the sphere of production, and that an enduring contradiction between life-making and profit-making is at the heart of capitalism. And this enduring contradiction is, I think, what my fellow panelists have been describing in their very kind of evocative comments in their the empirical details that they've been providing. So this understanding of this kind of contradictory but constitutive relation between production and reproduction is, of course, missing from mainstream discourses today, including those around gender. And mainstream economics often tends to, especially the neoliberal variety, tends to employ gender as a simple stand-in for the term women. So read gender as women, and it's treated as a largely non-intersectional biological category rather than a socially constructed one that's inflected with race and class and caste and so on and so forth. And I just want to, since our topic is reimagining economics, I just want to set up this contrast with mainstream ways of thinking about quote unquote gender with this quote from a 2020 American Economic Association keynote speech by an economist named Marianne Bertrand, where she says, in a moment when rising inequalities are fueling populist anger and fears about the future of democratic institutions, the gender angle to the inequality narrative undeniably provides one of the greatest causes for optimism. Across the world, gender gaps in education and labor force participation are on the decline. In the developed world, the gender gap in average labor market earnings continues to contract, with women, albeit slowly, improving their representation in the upper echelons of the income distribution. So this is a really interesting paragraph to me in the context of this decade and a half long disruption to what some sociologists and anthropologists have called the liberal settlement, which is a certain framework of capitalism and democracy that has just been assumed to be hegemonic. And a key component of which is the global North's confidence that it acts as a sort of civilizing force for the rest of us. And in this paragraph, you can feel some anxiety about that claim, but you can also see this person assert that the area of gender is one where that anxiety is calmed a little, right? Where we're still, there's cause for optimism and, we're doing well. But the way in which gender is inserted into the discussion of inequality, where it largely remains, rather than being treated as pervasive across all economic relations, the focus on the upper echelons of the income distribution, the optimism about this gender angle to the inequality narrative coming from the insertion of women into global and domestic supply chains of labor, capital, and trade, with a real silence on how those insertions may shape and be shaped by social reproduction. Right? Because the assumption is that the double burden problem that has been described, can be solved by outsourcing, right? In a capitalist sort of way, outsourcing that labor to someone else, which is usually brown and Black women and marginalized women and often men as well. So what's notable about the COVID lockdowns is that they really did disrupt, even if temporarily, right? But even for elites, they disrupted this assumption that they could manage the contradiction between production and reproduction through capitalist means. And again, I'm not saying it was a very temporary disruption for the real elites, but it was. And the endemic nature of COVID, I live in the United States, which is dealing with its so-called third wave. This endemic nature has sort of left a pervasive sense of unsettlement, right? A sense of discomfort that now shadows any cheerleading about what might be called lean-in feminism, right? Where you lean into capitalism. And I think, that's one of the reasons why care work has become such a big topic after COVID and so on. It's this sort of discomfort that has been kind of a result of COVID's impact. I, of course, work on India, where this kind of neoliberal optimism about gender has basically gone to die. Over the last 30 years of neoliberalism, we've had little evidence of any increase in women's labor force participation or entrepreneurship outside of really elite women. Violence against women, the maternal mortality rate, the child sex ratio have all proven extremely resistant to the medicine of economic growth. And in India, like you just described for both Ghana and South Africa, we've sort of seen a real collapse in women's ability to participate in the labor force in the aftermath of COVID. This has now been very well documented. So I think we're sort of seeing this moment of, as again, some of you pointed out, this moment of questioning some of these assumptions about how easily we can manage the contradiction between production and reproduction. So for those of us on the left then, how should we think about crises such as the current one from this Marxist feminist perspective of social reproduction? And 20th century Marxism, of course, did not really take social reproduction very seriously, or the labor of social reproduction as seriously as a component of labor as we might have desired. So from a perspective of just sort of thinking about crises, I think one, we probably need to widen our understanding of the kinds of capitalist crises to include explicitly the concept of a crisis of social reproduction. This follows in the footsteps of the work of Nancy Fraser and many others. The coronavirus crisis was not in the first instance a crisis of realization or profitability, as have been theorized widely in the Marxist literature, but one where the threat to accumulation and profit making came from a disruption to the production and maintenance of human life itself. And this was a particularly severe and very quick impact, right? But if the contradiction between production and reproduction is endemic to capitalism, then this kind of potential impact to accumulation from the inability to maintain and reproduce human life is also a persistent kind of possibility of crisis, right? And second, I think thinking about India in particular, we probably need to distinguish between crises of social reproduction for capital and those for labor. And the way, one might think about that is a crisis of social reproduction for capital occurs when the threat, the inability to maintain and reproduce human life actually affects profit making by disrupting the supply of labor power. But then, when we look around the societies that we are all part of in the global South, there's also this other kind of constant crisis of social reproduction for labor. And this occurs, when capital has effectively displaced the costs of social reproduction onto the backs of labor, and specifically into the sort of hidden abode of capitalism, where, you know, women and other, you know, family members, free labor is sort of being intensified to deal with this crisis. But when that is effectively done, labor has to take on those costs. Labor, specifically perhaps women and children, girls have to take on those costs, you know, because capital is able to push those costs onto labor. And, you know, that is the context in which, you know, going back to social movements and struggles, it seems like struggles emanating from the worlds of labor, with this expanded conception of labor that includes the labors of social reproduction that were not always recognized by Marxists either. You know, those kinds of struggles that push back against this displacement of costs onto laboring households, those kinds of struggles are probably, you know, what I would feel most optimistic about in terms of thinking about how an alternative future may be imagined. And in India, we do currently have some examples of very interesting struggles. And I think the history of these struggles that really take the labors of social reproduction into account is that they're often organized around non-class identities of gender, of race, of caste in the Indian case. And yet, you know, they're dealing with these issues that are inextricably linked to capitalist production processes. So I think, you know, those struggles are sort of probably our best hope. The question is whether on the left, you know, left movements can, as feminists like Silvia Federici have been arguing for so long, think about the terrain of social reproduction as also part of the terrain of struggle, and expand our understanding of work and workers to include those who perform this labor of social reproduction. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Rao. I think the Indian context is very interesting because India is sort of the developing world's golden child, and what countries like South Africa and Ghana have been working towards in terms of industrial policy. And the gender insights from India are a little bit scary, but I think there is, like you said, a lot of optimism there for us. Dr. Shepard, can I hand over to you?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me at REFA. This is my first time at REFA. I'm very excited to be here and to be on the panel with all these amazing academics. Just wanted to check, can you see my screen? My slides?
Yes. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a shift. I'm about to bombard you with quite a lot of graphs, so I apologize in advance. My sort of direct field of interest is microeconometrics, so I do a lot of data work, but through a gendered lens, which yeah, I hope will emanate through what I'm about to show you. And I do need to mention that this work is in collaboration with Professor Daniela Casale from the University of the Witwatersrand. So in terms of the impact that COVID-19 has had on work and life in South Africa, any analysis that we make of the data that has emerged from the NIDS-CRAM, which is a longitudinal study in which we tracked adult South Africans between April, May last year, 2020, and May this year, 2021. So it spans 12 months, although we do go back to February 2020 so that we can kind of get a measure of a pre-COVID labor market and household outcome. So in doing this analysis, we have to consider the interplay between reproductive and productive work, because what we have noticed since the onset of the COVID-19 crisis is that the social reproductive work that has been taken up by households has intensified. And because of this, it means that the impacts of COVID-19 is going to depend on many factors: the nature, composition of households, the socioeconomic relations between members of households, shifts in the balance within economic sectors, social protection, to mention a few. So I'll be focusing specifically on division of labor, household composition, occupational segregation, and social protection, and how these have blended gendered impacts in work and life of South African adults. So I'm first going to look at inequality in the labor market, and then how school closures impacted unpaid care work, and then inequality and social protection. So from the NIDS-CRAM, what we noticed is that in the initial month of the COVID-19 crisis, there was an estimated 3 million jobs lost. This is slightly more than what was estimated by the Quarterly Labour Force Survey in South Africa, which puts the loss at around 2.3, 2.4 million jobs. And what we also saw in the NIDS-CRAM data is that of these 3 million jobs that were lost, 2 million were accounted for by women. So there was a large, the jobs immediately lost in the hard lockdown in South Africa was disproportionately affecting women. This meant that women's employment fell by 22.5% at the start of the pandemic. And this is significantly larger than what the initial decline was for men, which was around 9.8%. By June 2020, jobs still remained pretty much at the level of April 2021, so not much recovery had occurred. But what we noticed with the NIDS-CRAM data is that as restrictions were lowered, jobs came back. So between June 2020 and October 2020, we saw that jobs for both men and women increased. But then when we moved into a harder lockdown in January 2020, in December, January this year, restrictions went up, jobs went down again. And then as restrictions eased, jobs went up again. So this is the interesting thing that has emerged from the NIDS-CRAM data, is that unlike the QLFS, where data is collected over a 3-month period and questions regarding labour market outcomes refer to the week prior to the interview, with NIDS-CRAM, we ask questions retrospectively going back a month. And so it wasn't really intended, but this is how it worked out, is that the NIDS-CRAM data collection actually mirrored perfectly with movements between lockdown levels. And so this is why we see more dramatic jumps in employment than what we have seen in the labour force surveys. So overall, what we saw is that over the first year of the pandemic, women's jobs were down 8.4%, whereas men's jobs had pretty much returned back to where they were. And again, to mention, this is specifically for our NIDS-CRAM sample, because what we do know in the QLFS is that there are still about 1.4 million jobs that were lost between February 2020 and June 2021. So we can also see this in terms of the employment to population ratio. Men's employment to population ratio in NIDS-CRAM was back to where it was, whereas women's is still down. And the other place where we can see the impacts of COVID quite severely in terms of gender, a gender difference, is in hours worked. So men's hours worked is in March 2021 back up to where it was in February 2020, but women's work is still, women's hourly hours per week worked is still down. So you'll notice that big dip in April 2020, that is the impact of furloughed work. So why this uneven impact and uneven recovery by gender in the labour markets? Well, myself and Daniela, we argue that gender-based occupational segregation is partly playing a role here. Women may have been more heavily concentrated in the types of jobs that were shed. We also argue that women may have been less able to take up new opportunities that were created. And the presence of school-going age children in the household appears to have significantly reduced the probability of women returning to work, but not for men. And we refer to this as the motherhood penalty. So to then go into that theme of childcare, around 3/4 of women in the NIDS-CRAM sample were living with at least one child, age 7 to 17, and roughly half with a very young child, age 0 to 6. Amongst men, it's less. 60% of men were living with at least one child and only 1/3 with a very young child. If we then consider those men and women who are living with very young children, 2/3 of women reported that they themselves were looking after these young children, whereas amongst men, this proportion was only 14 to 25%. So there's a very big gender difference in who is responsible for the care of particularly young children. And we can see this playing out in the number of hours that was spent on childcare per day between men and women. So throughout the year considered, women always reported more hours in childcare per day than did men. It is quite interesting to see that in April to June, there was a slight decline, but not significant. And the reason why there was a slight decline is because schools very slowly began to reopen in June. It was only grades 7 and 12 who returned. And also domestic workers and childminders working in private households would have been able to return around this time. But what we then see between June and October is a substantial decline in women's hours of childcare per day. And this is because by that time, all schools were open and all grades were allowed to return to school. So what we see is once schools reopened, there was a much stronger response by women in terms of the childcare burden that was now less. Moving from October to January, there was an increase again. This could be because of the higher lockdown restrictions, but also we know that December, January is the longest school holiday in South Africa. But what we do see is the increase was relatively greater for women. So once schools are closed, again, women take on a greater burden of childcare. So what we concluded from this is that the time that women spend on childcare is very responsive to school closures and reopening. And the gender gap in childcare hours actually rose at times when schools were closed and narrowed when schools were open. Then lastly, in terms of social protection, and this is something that what we notice in the data is something that has contributed to a dramatic policy shift, which we are very happy about. So women account for roughly 47% of the labor force, and during the 12 months analyzed, 57 to 60% of the broad unemployed. And as you saw earlier, most of the COVID-19 related job losses. Yet they received less income support targeted specifically at the unemployed and furloughed workers. So the UIF TERS, which was support provided to employers on behalf of employees. And what we found is that within the UIF TERS, roughly 35 to 40% of the recipients were women. So UIF TERS was disproportionately awarded to men. And the reason this is because women are less likely to be formally employed and therefore registered for unemployment insurance. So because of this issue of a large informal sector and a growth in the unemployed who would not be registered with the UIF, the government introduced a social relief of distress grant, which is 350 Rand a month, and again, disproportionately being awarded to men. And the reason for this is because the social relief of distress grant could not be paid out concurrently with any other grants, such as the child support grant. So unlike the SRDG, the social relief of distress grants, the initial reason given for why those receiving a social grant from government were not allowed to get the SRD was because they were getting separate top-ups. But these top-ups were only in place between May and October 2020, whereas the social relief of distress grant was actually extended beyond October 2020. And it became immediately quite clear that there is a danger of tying individuals' access to social protection to their caregiving role. And so since March, April this year, there's been a push by civic society to try and get women who are receiving the child support grant to also be able to get the social relief of distress grant. And that has subsequently been taken up. And so as of last month, there are roughly 3 to 4 million additional women who have now become eligible for the social relief of distress grant. And this is really important because what we've seen is that the underrepresentation of women amongst social protection targeting has increased food insecurity and hunger, mostly amongst women. So almost 40% of women reported running out of money for food in April 2021 compared to 31% of men. And 17% of women living with children reported that a child had gone hungry in the last week in April 2021. And this is significantly higher than 11% of men. And what we also know is that women's mental health is more strongly impacted by food insecurity. And so this would have repercussions for both future food security as well as children's physical and socio-emotional development. But something that's also emerged in the data is that even though women's mental health is more strongly impacted by food insecurity, psychological distress or depressive symptoms have been greater amongst men than they have been amongst women. And this then has impacts for interpersonal violence, not only linked to food insecurity, but also psychological distress. And so we are hoping that sometime in the near future, we would be able to collect a 6th wave of this data so that we would then be able to see whether or not the extension of the social relief distress grant to women has indeed assisted in tackling some of these disparities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Shepherd. I see that we have about 25 minutes for the question and answer portion of the segment, which is always great. I have been typing in the chat that you can use the Q&A function to ask questions, but I think I will also allow people to just raise their hands and we can take questions that way. Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands. I'm very impressed with the turnout, by the way. I think this is great because this is a very important topic that usually doesn't get much coverage. Even within heterodox economics, the issues around gender, like all the speakers have said, are sort of like maligned and discussed as just women's issues, when from the presentations we can tell that the implications are like far-ranging. Yes, they affect the lives of women, but they also affect the economies of countries as a whole. So I really appreciated the attendance. I'm just looking for the hands. Okay, it seems that no one wants to ask questions. So I think I'll just ask with a question of my own for the most recent speaker. I've noted a few things that I thought were interesting in everyone's presentations, but in terms of policy, and I think everyone in the panel can comment on this, how well does the research and the data that's been accumulated during the COVID period translate into government action and policy making? Dr. Shepherd or Dr. Darkwah, you can answer that question, I think.
So I'll go first. Thank you everyone for the really interesting presentations. I think the thing about Ghana and many other developing countries is that we already had a crisis given the 40 years of neoliberalism we have endured. And COVID is sort of like just when we are barely able to survive, in comes COVID and makes our situation worse. So the reason why I was focusing on water in my presentation was, this is a country where we haven't worked very well on ensuring that basic social services are available, right? Water provision is essential to our everyday lives, but it's a headache that women have to worry about. So when they go to parliament and they are making decisions, that's not necessarily what gets focused on. So when COVID hits and the government makes a policy that on the face of it is very brilliant, it sounds fantastic. We need water. They say we should wash our hands often. So let's make it free. And then you discover that actually it's the richer folk who are benefiting from it and the poorer folk do not benefit at all. And the response really has to be a response that begins to take into account just the ways in which we function as a nation state. And whether we are going to put more money towards providing basic infrastructure in our country, or we are going to be servicing debt and loans taken from the international financial institutions. And that's a conversation that we are not necessarily having in our country right now. So, I mean, everybody was praising the government for the thought. It was a thoughtful decision. But when you started to look very closely at the impact, it didn't deliver what they were hoping it would deliver. And it points to the fact that we need to start from the basics and rethink what we are doing using this neoliberal framework of capitalist system. It doesn't work at all. I find the South African case really fascinating because, I mean, there's a grant and we can talk about the adequacy of the grant or not, right? But there's something that we didn't have in this context at all. It wasn't even up for conversation. Yes, we have the LEAP, which is our equivalent, I would say. It goes to 400,000 individuals. Ghana has a population of 30 million, just to give you a sense of the disconnect between the reality on the ground and what we get in terms of support. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insight, Doctor. Something that I think any of you can answer, unfortunately, that has been asked in the chat is how the concept of social reproduction relates to gender-based violence in all these contexts. I don't know who wants to take that question. I think it's open for anyone. Dr. Shepherd, this was discussed a bit in your presentation. Would you like to answer that question?
I'm not going to be able to answer that question, unfortunately, because I don't want to claim that gender-based violence is an area of expertise for me. It is something that, you know, in terms of the research that I've been involved in, which is focused more at these, you know, sort of hard indicators of employment, hours, earnings, attendance of learners at school, I feel that a lot of these peripheral, the sort of invisible pandemic has been ignored. And I think gender-based violence is part of that invisible pandemic, as is hunger. Just to speak to the previous question about policy, the fact that we had this NIDS crime data that was being collected so rapidly, and we as researchers were given 4 weeks to analyze the data, write up a report and have it put out into the public domain. One of the things that emerged from it is that schools were not feeding children. And I think if we hadn't had that data, we would not have known that. And the result of having that data meant that the DBE, the Department of Basic Education, could be held accountable for not feeding 10 million children as they had targeted to do so. I mean, just to think about the 3 months in which not a single child was fed at school is, to me, unfathomable. It cannot be that we let 10 million children go without a single meal for 3 months. And even today, 1.5 million children are not being fed of the 10 million who should be fed. So I do think this kind of rapid data, this rapidly collected data, becomes very important if we are going to be able to identify these blind spots, because the reason why school feeding was stopped is because the argument is school feeding is something that takes place when schools are open. No, school feeding is something that should take place whether schools are open or not, even during school holidays. Holiday hunger is a big problem. So yeah, don't think that answers the gender-based violence question, but I do think, you know, the invisible pandemic is something which we still need to find out more about.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Another interesting question is, Dr. Rao, in your presentation, you sort of spoke about how the lockdowns during the pandemic interrupted the outsourcing of gendered labor, which kind of in a neoliberal market makes it very easy for us to, you know, sort of like place the fact that work is gendered on the back burner because it's displaced to like poorer women, usually Black and brown women. In terms of that observation, do you think there will be any type of long-term structural changes made into how gendered labor isn't being addressed? It's sort of being like outsourced in the market.
You know, yeah, in terms of whether there will be a response, I think that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I do, you know, again, living in the US, it's been interesting to see the differences between India and the US and the sort of the specific political economy of the moment at which the COVID crisis hit, I think is part of that. Because in the US, there has been, you know, partly because of the particular regime that has come to power here, there is an increased focus on a massive childcare subsidy for the very first time, right, on a scale that the US has never seen. There is, you know, at least this particular government is talking about childcare infrastructure and so on and so forth in ways that do seem to suggest that there is a response to the way that the crisis was experienced in the last year and a half. And to the point about school feeding, there's been a massive effort to distribute food even when schools are closed. I mean, these are all questions that surfaced, and this particular moment in the US, they are being addressed to some extent by the state in ways that we haven't necessarily seen in the US before. On the other hand, in India, where also there's a huge amount of dependence on the informal and underpaid labors of women who are migrants from villages, who come into the cities and then serve as the nannies and the maids of, you know, upper caste and upper class households. You know, there, as you all may have read, at least in the early days, the response was simply to let the migrants fend for themselves. And we know that millions of them went back. And it is not entirely clear, because we don't have the data, whether they have come back or not. And it is not entirely clear, you know, how the crisis and the absence of those workers is therefore manifesting inside households in India. What we do know is that the women's labor force participation rate dropped sharply. We do know that whatever revival, a major revival of jobs has taken place in the quote unquote self-employed category, which is a very ambiguous, as we all know so well, category in India and in the rest of the global South. So we don't really know what that means in terms of stable or decent employment and income. So, my own take is that, again, at the national level in India, this particular regime seems to just assume that, laboring households will somehow figure it out. I don't, if there's anybody in the audience who kind of is aware of Indian policies in this respect, you can correct me, but I am not aware of any systematic effort to address what must be a crisis in, Indian households as well, in urban areas in particular. And the assumption seems to be that, it will be figured out within the private realm of the household. So in the Indian case, I don't really see the kind of response that I do think we're seeing in the United States. Yeah, so.
Thank you for that, Doctor. I have a few more questions. This question has been posed to the panel in general, but I think Odile Mackett, since your research has been around work and what we frame as work when doing research, this question says, how do you suggest policy is developed and to incorporate unpaid / economically unproductive work that women do, so the recognition of that work, but also the tangible compensation that should be done?
Thanks, Yasa. I think that's an interesting question. I think it's something that, feminists, not just feminist economists, have been grappling with for decades. There are some people who say, you should pay women for the work, and then there are others that say, if you pay people, you're just sort of reinforcing those capitalist relations, that we're sort of trying to dismantle. But I think in other countries, we've also seen what happens if you sort of try to force men to participate. So I know there are countries where men are sort of forced to take a certain period of maternity leave. And there is some evidence that has sort of helped men and women balance their responsibilities more equally. But there's also evidence that shows that, if you do have very liberal policies for both men and women, then women end up working like in sort of public sector jobs, and then they tend to be underrepresented in private sector jobs. So I think that, no one has sort of like found all the answers. Although I do feel like one thing that we can do is to actually start measuring it seriously. I know, there's like a lot of data that has gone around, and the NerdScam data has also to an extent asked people about, who spend time on this labor, but I think that really the only way that we can actually see what people are doing, who's doing what, is with time use data. And there are a lot of countries where they are regularly collecting that, but I think in a lot of African countries, because data collection agencies or statistical agencies are so revenue, they're sort of having to choose between, collecting GDP data or collecting time use data, or collecting the labor force survey data or collecting the time use data. And that's specifically what's happened in our case as South Africa. I think the next third wave of time use data was supposed to come out in 2016, and then it was 2020. I mean, we're almost in 2022 now, we still don't have it. So it's just, sort of going back to that notion that if you can't measure something, then you can't get to a place where you can formulate appropriate policies to sort of fix what you can see in the data. So currently it's just like, we're sort of feeling around in the dark, and we're asking people, you're doing more of this, are you doing less of that? But I think we do need to get a more accurate picture of what we are working with.
Yeah, thank you for that response. I think we have time to answer one more question, which is also general, and I think I'll give the entire panel an opportunity to just answer and then give their concluding remarks. We end at 15:15, so about 10 minutes left there. And this is from Neil Coleman, and he says, we've heard about how countries and states with a socialist orientation / background of whatever variety have coped better with COVID. Think Vietnam, Kerala, Cuba. Have these societies implemented measures which respond to / mitigate against the differential gender impacts of COVID, which the panel has so powerfully spoken about? Are there other best practices internationally which come to mind? So I think in speaking order, we can start with Dr. Darkwah and then finish with Dr. Shepherd.
Thank you. So I've been thinking about Neil's question, and I honestly don't have a good answer for him. I do know that the Feminist Economics Journal, I think it's the volume 3 this year, has a special issue on gender and COVID. And I know that there's an article in there that looks at actually women-led governments and the ways in which they did things that are different. Now, whether or not in doing things that were different, they paid attention to social reproduction issues, I cannot guarantee you, but I know that article is available. And so perhaps Neil could take a look at that. And I mean, I also do know that there's work being done that seeks to look at what different countries have done and which works or doesn't work. And I think this question really links back to Odile's point about how do we address women's unpaid labor? Do we pay for it, or do we see that if we pay for it, given our current capitalist economic system, we are just reinforcing a problematic system, and we don't want to be doing that. So when we are thinking about policies, I think most of what we are seeing in terms of policies are policies that are very much structured in a capitalist system and seeking to make improvements in that capitalist system. And I think what we really need to begin to do is to rethink that and ask ourselves, can we do something differently? The capitalist economic system definitely has not delivered for Africa. It may have delivered for Europe, they can debate that. But when you look at the global South, I don't think we can say the capitalist project has delivered for us. So given that, should we be seeking to improve policies within that context, or should we be thinking outside the box completely about what kinds of things we need to do? I don't think we have enough conversations about that, which is why I think this was a great panel, and we need many more of these where people from different parts of the globe, different parts of the global South especially, can have these conversations and think about how we move not just the discussion forward, but action forward to change lives for people on the ground. So thank you very much for inviting me to this. I'd heard about REFA before, but I'd never been invited. And so I feel especially honored that I was invited to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for your time and research and presenting. Thank you to all of you, actually. We've enjoyed having you for this discussion. I think you've really given good insights. I've been taking notes throughout, even though I'm supposed to be coordinating the whole thing. Odile, do you have anything to say to Neil or just in general in closing?
Thanks, yeah. Neil, I'm sorry, I don't have any specific knowledge of those countries either. But I'd like to echo the comment that Prof. Darkwah made about, women's leadership, and I think part of it is that, those countries have displayed a more compassionate leadership. And we can also think of the economy that's something that's more compassionate than it is, right? Something that Madeleine Power calls it social provisioning. It's the process of social provisioning, rather than just, making profits or whatever. We're actually taking care of people. But just coming to the socialist orientation, I would imagine, the definition of a socialist country is that government sort of plays a bigger role in delivery of whatever needs to be delivered. And if we think about the economic ecosystem, and perhaps I'm simplifying it a bit by just including, businesses or the market, the government and the households, I think although capitalism is the problem and capitalism is not going to be brought down tomorrow, we sort of have to work with what we have right now. There is an opportunity for us within the system to sort of spread the burden. And currently, I think the problem is that households carry too much of that burden. And in very sort of extreme forms of capitalist societies, we sort of expect businesses to say, oh, okay, it's fine, we'll sort of take on that burden, but obviously it's not in their interest to do so. So if we are in a more socialist orientation, and government can take on that responsibility, I think that, just because you're in you're in a socialist society doesn't necessarily mean, that government will automatically provide all these services that businesses won't. But I do think it is in their interest to do so more than it is in the interest of businesses. And so I think based on Neil's comment, it would make sense to me then that in a socialist society, they would fare better in COVID, because like many people have said, COVID wasn't a crisis of something that happened right now. COVID became a crisis because of how our economies and our societies have been structured before, the pandemic came along. So if we are set up better, to deal with these crises, then it'll be better or easier to sort of sail through them. And yeah, perhaps the answer is just, to spread the burden somehow, between the three institutions.
Yeah, I think you're really echoing Prof. Darkwah's sentiments there.
Yeah, I can maybe say something about Kerala, and yeah, I think what we've learned is that certainly Kerala, which is unusual in India because of, I think, the extent to which the state does subsidize some key elements of social reproduction, including public health. So Kerala's public health infrastructure has been invested into a much greater extent than most of the rest of India. And there are two neighboring states that have never had communist governments. So Kerala keeps switching. It has sort of a competitive political environment where you have the communist government, and then that government is displaced. And then, so it's been back and forth. But consistently, there has been a significant investment in the public health infrastructure, in particular, and some other aspects of social reproduction. And there are a couple of other neighboring South Indian states where, again, there's never been an officially communist party in power. However, there has been, again, investment in public health. And the other really interesting thing is a real expansion of this cooked meals provision. So like these subsidized, where the food is already cooked and it's provided to people at a very, very low cost. And I think it's clear that in terms of managing the impacts of COVID as a public health crisis, these states have done better. Ironically, unfortunately, because they also test more, they also sometimes show up as having higher cases and higher deaths. So it's kind of hard to exactly measure. But I think a lot of expert analyses do suggest that in terms of managing this as a public health crisis, these states have done better. But I think the question of whether that then addresses gender differentiated impacts of the pandemic, I think the jury is out on that, because as we know, many socialist countries have nevertheless had, deeply patriarchal arrangements of the division of labor, both in the public and the private sphere. This continues to be true of states like Kerala too, which can be very casteist in certain aspects, very highly gendered in certain aspects of the division of labor. The state has been accused of employing women's volunteer work to kind of address the healthcare crisis. So there's been a whole debate about, whether the state has sort of pulled these women in without fairly compensating them. So I don't know that I have a good answer on the gender differentiated part, but I think on just managing the crisis as a public health crisis, it does appear that these regimes have done better. And I think I'll leave it. And again, thank you so much for having me. This was really a wonderful discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Yeah, I think that nuance between the handling of it as a public health crisis and then also addressing the productive and reproductive issues in a very distinct way is important, because we can't just have a blanket answer for everything. Dr. Shepard, I think you can sort of take us home and then we can have a wrap up.
Yeah, I had to agree so much with what all the other panelists said, especially that last point of Smriti's about, those countries not necessarily having a sort of, mitigated the gendered impact necessarily. I also don't know anything about those countries in particular, but something I just was thinking about as the other panelists were talking is that, even if, we did, here in South Africa, we did have these, the social protection that was introduced that did help to some extent alleviate some of the burden of the crisis. So, for example, the social leave for distress grant, there's some analysis that has showed that it assisted people in remaining within the labor market because it freed them up to be able to go and search for work, for example. But the point I want to make there is that, even though these grants have been provided, people are still having to go and search for certain services within the market in order to make proper use of that welfare. So an example would be in education, for example. We know that in South Africa, there are many kids who are transported to school. So the grant income is used in order to pay for that private transport. There is very little public transport that is used to get kids from home to school. And so what we've seen in South Africa this year is almost 500,000 extra children who have dropped out of school. And one of the reasons for this might be because parents just cannot afford the private cost, the additional private cost of getting kids to school. So if we actually had a public education system that meant that kids could get good quality education on their doorsteps, instead of having to seek education outside of their immediate neighborhoods, then I think that would have had a that would have had a very big would have made a big difference in what we're seeing right now. So yes, you know, it's great that these this additional social protection exists, but it still is interacting with the markets at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Shepherd, and thank you to the entire panel. As has been said by Bandila repeatedly in the chat box, please don't forget to fill out our survey on what you thought on the festival. I can't thank you enough. This panel has been really enriching, and I think there was sort of like a cohesive theme around how this crisis isn't anything new, but we've gained new insights from it. And I think the resurgence of Marxist feminist economics analysis, and even in other disciplines like sociology, sort of being taken more seriously in this moment, is going to hopefully be more impactful in how our governments, especially in the developing world, deal with crises like this in future. Because unfortunately, I don't think this moment in history will be the last time that we see something this catastrophic, unfortunately, with the climate crisis and everything else. Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you to all the attendees. This has been really, really enriching. Thank you, everyone. And to everyone who's asked, the recording will be available.
Thank you so much.